41 in queue and the board bleeding red. Artyom logged the kitchen fire on Sovetskaya, dispatched the nearest engine, watched the icon crawl across the grid like a tick fattening on a dog. Cold coffee at his elbow. He'd poured it at hour 9 and now it skinned over, a gray film he kept not drinking because drinking it would mean admitting he'd lost track of when 9 was. Hour 14. He counted it off the corner of the screen, not the clock on the wall, because the wall clock ran 2 minutes fast, and 2 minutes was a person. The headset chewed at his ear. He keyed the next line. 112, what is your emergency? A man, drunk, a dog that wouldn't stop barking. Artyom triaged it down, logged it, queued it behind the things that bled. The board didn't care how tired he was. The board only counted. 41 became 39, became 44, as 3 new calls dropped in the time it took him to breathe. And somewhere in the building, the night supervisor's chair sat empty because she'd gone home at midnight and nobody came to fill it. 7 operators on the floor at shift start. 3 now. He'd stopped looking at the empty consoles the way you stop looking at a missing tooth with your tongue. Eventually. Mostly. Not really. Triage. Queue. Dispatch. Dead air between. He drank the coffee finally. It tasted like the inside of the headset foam, like 14 hours of his own breath recycled, and he set the cup down on the same ring it had left an hour ago, a brown halo on the laminate that he'd memorized without meaning to. The board flickered. A new ticket dropped to the top of his stack, auto-assigned. Caller location pinging the highway loop, the bad curve past the reservoir where the guardrail had been on the maintenance list since spring, and the maintenance list was a graveyard. He keyed it without looking at the number. You never looked at the number first. The number was for the report. 112, what is your emergency? Static. Then a sound under the static. The particular geometry of a car that has stopped being a car. The tick of a cooling engine, glass settling, a horn holding one long, flat note somewhere it shouldn't. Caller, can you hear me? Tell me where you are. And then the voice came through, and his hands stopped on the keys. Papa? Lena. The dispatcher and him kept working for one more half-second. The trained animal that didn't need him present. Confirm location, confirm conscious, keep them talking. And his fingers actually moved toward the trace, toward the protocol, before the rest of him caught up to the single fact the board had handed him without ceremony. His daughter's voice, the reservoir curve, a horn that wouldn't stop. Lena, not protocol, her name. Lena, I'm here. Don't move. Tell me. The line did the thing lines do. It cut. Not the slow death of a battery, not the swallowing fuzz of a tunnel. A clean cut, mid-syllable, the way someone closes a door on a word, and you spend the rest of your life filling in the half you didn't get. He hit recall. The system asked him to confirm. He confirmed. It rang into the dead place where rung phones go. 4 tones. 5. And the board behind that single ringing number kept right on counting. 44. 46. Every other emergency in the city stacking up patient and indifferent while he listened to nothing answer nothing. 6. 7 rings. He stood up. He didn't remember standing. The chair rolled back and hit the console behind him, and the operator there, a kid named Vins, 3 months on the floor, looked over with a question already dying on his face. Trace this, Artyom said, or tried to. The words came out wrong. They came out tilted, the consonants sliding off the edge of his mouth, like the coffee skin sliding off a tipped cup. And the right side of the room went soft and far. A photograph of a room rather than a room. White. Not pain first. The white came first. A flashbulb behind the eyes. The screen going to that emergency blank he'd seen 1,000 times when the system rebooted. Then the pain, arriving the way pain arrives in the tickets. Sudden onset, no warning, patient collapsed. A spike driven through the left temple and out somewhere there was no out. His hand was still on the keyboard. He felt that. The last clear input his body logged. 4 fingertips on warm plastic. The F key's little raised nub under the index. The keystroke half pressed and never completed. The The floor came up, or he went down to it. The vestibular question didn't resolve. Above him, the board kept its tally, indifferent as a tide table. The red icons multiplying across the grid of a city that would need someone to answer it, and would, in about 90 seconds, have one fewer. Vince was shouting. The sound reached Artyom flattened, post-processed. A recording of a shout played in another room. He thought, with the last clean piece of him, in the only grammar he had left. Caller still on the line. Caller unreached. Do not clear the ticket. The ringing in his dead headset went to 8. He had never let it reach 8. Not once in 19 years. You answered before 8 or the answering stopped meaning anything. And now the 8th tone landed in an ear that could no longer triage it. And his daughter's call sat at the top of a queue no one was working. The light on his console stayed green. He didn't. He was standing. That was the first wrong fact. And he logged it the way he logged everything that didn't fit the call. Flat. No editorializing. File it and keep working. A body does not go from the dispatch floor's industrial carpet to upright without a transition. His did. No interval, no ambulance, no white corridor of the kind the survivors described in their statements. One moment the keyboard's warm plastic. The next, his soles flat on cold stone, and the cold coming up through them like a current looking for ground. The air tasted of mineral and rendered fat. He knew tallow. Knew it from the candle fire reports, the ones where someone fell asleep beside the wick and the curtains went up. This was that smell, dialed down to a steady, low burn, dozens of small flames somewhere above him guttering in a draft that smelled of wet rock. He breathed it in and his lungs took it. So, he was breathing. He filed that under patient conscious, airway clear, and did not let himself ask the next question on the form. In front of him, a console, not his. Not the gray industrial unit with the F key's worn nub. This one was made of light, carved. That was the only word his mouth found for it. Light folded into the shape of an interface and set into a lectern of black stone, the glyphs standing up out of the surface like frost on a window rendered in gold. It listed entries. It scrolled. It sorted. A dispatcher's eye reads a cue before the conscious mind consents, and his eye read this one in the half-second before the rest of him caught up. 412. 412 entries, stacked and ranked, each one tagged with 2 values his training translated on contact. Priority, and a second column that resolved, after a beat, into ETA. Time to event. How long until the thing they were afraid of arrived? He had spent 19 years reading exactly those 2 numbers off exactly that kind of column, and his hand rose toward the surface to triage before he had decided his hand should move. The light gave under his fingers, cold as morgue tile. 7 of the entries burned brighter than the rest, pulled forward, active, live on the board. He counted them, 1 through 7. Habit. The 8th entry sat just below the line, dimmed, waiting, and his hand drifted toward it the way it always drifted toward the next ticket, because there was always a next ticket, because the queue did not care that you had a number you couldn't put down. He reached for the 8th. White. Not the screen blank white of before. This came with edges. A spike driven in above the left eye and out through the back of the skull. The same trajectory the pain had taken on the floor of the dispatch center, and his hand snapped back from the light before he'd consciously ordered the retreat. The 7 held steady. The 8th stayed dim. He stood with his palm cradled against his chest and understood the rule the way you understand a third rail, not as instruction, as injury. 7 slots. 7 and no more. He breathed through it, counted the breaths, 1 to 7, stopped at 7, out of a caution that was already becoming superstition. The pain ebbed. The console waited, indifferent as a tide table. 412 pleas stacked patient behind 7 that he was apparently expected to work. And somewhere in the architecture of him, the trained animal had already begun to sort. Which were dying now, which could hold, which were a drunk's barking dog dressed up as a fire. He looked closer at the live 7. The carved light spelled them out, and they were not addresses. A child, fevered, the mother kneeling, Two brothers over a failed well. A woman counting her flour against the day's pleas. The word arrived, and he refused it for a moment and then accepted it, because the form does not care what you call the thing, only that you log it true. Prayers. The column he'd read as ETA was the same number it had always been. How long until what they feared came true? Stone walls rose around the lectern, fitted without mortar, sweating faint condensation in the candlelight. High up, narrow as arrow slits, gaps let in a gray that might have been dawn or dusk. There was a smell of wood smoke under the tallow now, the particular thin smoke of poor fires in small houses, the kind he'd dispatched against 100 times. And somewhere out past the stone, faintly, the sound of a settlement going about the business of being afraid. A parish. His. The way the night shift had been his. Theirs to call, his to answer, or not. He almost laughed. Didn't. The laugh would have cost more than he had. Then he saw the wall. To the left of the console, across the bare black stone, something moved that was not candlelight. A number. It welled up out of the rock itself, dark red, the color of a board gone fully critical, and it bled there in figures a hand high, slow as a wound deciding to open. 73. Beneath it, smaller, the unit, in a script he had never learned and read anyway because the tower meant him to. Days to the rift. He stood in a dead man's silence and read the countdown the way he had read the recall ringing to 8, knowing, with the cold, clean part of him that never stopped working, that it was already running, that no one had paused it for his arrival, and that the queue at his back had been waiting on a keeper who would not come until now. The keeper was him. He stepped back. 1 pace. The cold seam between 2 flagstones found his heel. A man who steps off the board is a man off shift, and the man off shift owes nothing to the queue. He'd said it to rookies to make them go home, and he said it to himself now, backing toward a wall that hadn't been behind him a breath ago. Fever dream. 19 years bred them. The headset you couldn't pry loose, calls bleeding into sleep until sleep itself ran as unpaid overtime. This was that. He waited to wake. The candles waited with him. There was a chair, black wood, no cushion, set behind the lectern at the exact remove he'd have called ergonomic in another life, worn to a shine by someone used hard and gone. He did not take it. He folded his arms. He counted the gray in the arrow slits and decided it was getting on toward a shift change that would never come, and he stood there refusing the only furniture in the room, the way a man refuses to sign a form he hasn't read. Above him, a flame went out. Not guttered. Out. A clean, small extinction, a thread of smoke standing where light had been. On the console, one of the live 7 dimmed and slid sideways, and the queue behind it shuffled up a rank the way a board reseats when a caller stops breathing. He read the vacated line before he could stop himself. The well. The younger brother. The second column had run to 0. Nobody had worked it. He didn't move. Another candle, an hour on by the cooling of the room and the stiffening in his knees. Then 2 close together, the way calls cluster when a thing goes wrong for a whole street at once. A main, a fire, a curve on a reservoir road. Each death freed a slot. Each freed slot filled from the 400. The queue did not shrink. The parish did. Somewhere past the stone, a settlement was thinning house by house, and his trained ear had already started mapping it without consent. Not a wall of noise, but a grid, a structure, a thing that could in theory be held if a man had hands enough and a system to run them through. He had run a system once. He knew what one cost. He started counting the dead candles and made himself stop at the 2nd hour. Past a number, the names stopped being names. He knew that arithmetic in the spine. He'd built a career on the 7 he could carry and a silence for the rest, and the silence had always been a door that closed at end of shift. There was no end of shift here. The number on the wall bled its slow red, 73, 73, indifferent. And below it, the smaller script, and around the lectern the smell of poor wood smoke thinned as fewer poor fires got lit. A child was crying out there. Then not. He looked at the live 7. A child, fevered, the mother kneeling. The ETA on it had dropped while he played at being a man off shift. Hours, where there'd been a day. The mother was still in the carved light, still down on her knees. The tower did not render her face, and he was grateful for that, the way he'd been grateful for the glass between him and the street. He stepped to the console, told himself it was to read it. A dispatcher reads before he keys. He was only confirming the fever, only proving the dream by touching a thing that would dissolve under his hand. His fingers found the fevered child's line. The light gave, cold as morgue tile, and did not dissolve. He seated it. He hadn't known the verb until his hand performed it. A press, a draw. The prayer lifted out of its rank and set live and held, the way you commit a unit to a call and own whatever comes back. The tower took it. Something poured out of the stone, and out of him along with it, a pull at the base of the skull, not the white spike of the 8th, but a steady tax, current crossing a meter. The ETA stopped falling. Then it climbed. Hours became a day. The candle over his head, the one he hadn't known was hers, quit its drowning flutter, stood up straight, and burned. He laid his palm flat on the console and felt the held thing hold. Out past the wall, faint, the crying did not resume, which is its own kind of report. A fever breaking, a mother rising off her knees to wet a cloth, a house that would light its poor fire tomorrow night. He logged it without words. One held. He looked at the 6 still live, and the 400 ranked behind them, and the dark red number that hadn't so much as blinked for the life he'd just bought. Not a dream. He sat down in the dead keeper's chair because his legs had finished arguing, and he did the math he'd been refusing since the floor of the dispatch center. 7 slots. 412 waiting. Deaths by the hour and 1 set of hands. The chair fit him like it had been measured. Cold under the wrists first. The lectern's lip where he'd braced. Black stone leaching the warmth out of his forearms and offering nothing in return. He'd been a man who couldn't read a word of it. Now he could. It came the way a foreign caller came over the line on a bad night. Not all at once, not a translation, but a rhythm his ear caught and held while the brain ran behind to catch up. He'd worked enough of those. A woman screaming in a language he'd never studied, and still he'd pulled the address out of her by cadence, by the shape of fear, by the 3 syllables that meant fire in every tongue because fear is monosyllabic everywhere. The glyphs did that. They stood up off the carved light like gold frost, and one of them resolved under his attention into a sound, then a word, then a meaning he hadn't asked for. Plea. Petition. The thing a person says when the saying is all that's left. He read the top line without trying. A fissure, north water, a squall coming. The petitioner could feel in a bad knee. Below it, a birth gone sideways, a midwife's hands, a breach. Below that, a debt, and a man with a knife and the wrong kind of patience. 12 dialects in the first 40 lines, and he took them the way he'd taken the nightboard, not as language, but as load. He stopped fighting it around the 3rd line. That was the surrender, and it was a small one, the size of a man finally keying the headset he's been holding at arm's length. The tongue came in after that, like water finding the low floor. He didn't learn it, it arrived. By the bottom of the visible queue, he was reading a herdsman's prayer in some clipped upland speech, as fast as he'd once read a street address off a screen. And the speed of it sat wrong in his chest, the way competence always sits wrong when you didn't earn it slow. 2 columns. He knew 2 columns, priority and ETA. He didn't have to be told what they were, because he'd lived inside that exact grid for 19 years under different names: severity and time to scene. The most dead soonest goes first. The screaming man who'll keep is made to keep. He started resorting the 400 in his head before he'd decided to, dragging the berth above the fissure, because a breach runs out of road faster than a squall, holding the knife debt where it sat, because a man with a knife is a slow ETA until he isn't. Triage. The word was a comfort, and he didn't trust comforts. He watched a number move. The fissure's ETA, second column, sliding down as the squall walked in off the carved water. And he understood the thing he'd half seen with the fevered child, made into law. Answer fast, and the event never lands. Answer fast enough, and a hamlet that would have drowned wakes up to wet nets and a story. He could buy whole streets if he timed the press to the dip, if he seated a slot at the moment the ETA still had slack in it. And the inverse. The inverse he learned by leaving a thing alone. He didn't mean to. He meant only to watch the berth, to confirm his sort, to prove the grid behaved. He held off the press to see the ETA fall, the way you let a clock run to check it keeps time. And it fell, and kept falling. And at the bottom of it the line went gray and slid up a rank, and a candle somewhere over his head performed its clean, small extinction, and the midwife's hands in the carved light simply stopped being rendered. Held too long, it burned. That was the other half of the law. A slot answered late was a slot that taught you the cost of reading instead of keying. He logged it. He did not count it. There was a difference, and he kept the difference like a tool. The held child he counted. 1. A number he could carry up a flight of stairs. The midwife he logged, a line gone gray at 04 something on a clock that didn't exist. Cause of loss, operator delay. And he wrote no name into the gap, because writing the name was how you stopped being able to do the next one. 6. Live. He'd let the 7th lapse to school himself, and the schooling held. He pulled his hand back and made the board show him itself. Sorted by ETA, the Q was a wave, events landing in clusters, a bad hour here, a quiet stretch there, the squall and the knife and the breach bunching at the near edge like calls stacking when a storm crosses a county. Sorted by priority, it was a different shape, a longer reach. He could run either. He'd run both at once for 19 years on 7 trunk lines and a rookie who couldn't trace a callback. 7 slots. The thought arrived flat and practical, the way load balancing always had. Not enough hands. Build hands. He didn't know yet what hands meant here. A system, though, a system he knew. You don't carry 400. You carry 7, and you build the thing that carries the rest. The relay, the second shift, the floor under the floor. He flexed his fingers over the carved light and felt the cold give a half degree, learning him back. Then a line near the bottom. Rank 300 and something, far down where the dim ones waited. Climbed. Past 200. Past 1. Priority spiking with nothing he'd touched to spike it. ETA collapsing on its own, and the script beside it resolved under his eye into a dialect he already, impossibly, knew. Whisper. The keeper. Come quick. The prayer was about him. Speak it again, slower. He pressed the climbing line, and it opened. Not to carved water, but to a voice, dry as chalk, a man laying the prayer tongue down, careful as a scribe inking under a failing lamp. The man gave his location before his fear, the way a good caller names the cross street before the blood. Brother Olin. Cleric and scribe of Whisper, who had felt the keeper change the way you feel a draft when a door opens 2 rooms off. You answer now, Olin said, not a question. I answer now. Dead air. Then the cleric did the first useful thing anyone had done since Artyom woke on his feet. He reported, unasked, household by household, the sick and the spent and the dark windows, until the parish stopped being 400 lines of script and became a street he could picture, a floor. He'd been handed a man standing on a floor. He set Olin to work before the prayer closed. Confirm outcomes. When a fever breaks, you walk to the house and learn it and pray it back to me. Lived or didn't, yes or no, nothing else. Callbacks. 19 years he'd run blind on outcomes, never knowing if the ambulance arrived, and here was a cleric who could close the loop on foot. He gave him the format too. Location, then severity, then need, in that order, every time. Drill the children, drill the fishwives. Teach Whisper to pray like a caller, and the lines would arrive pre-sorted. It took 3 days. It felt like weeks. He stopped seating all 7 at once. A man who fills every slot has nothing left when the wave crests, so he held 3 live under steady tacks, and kept 4 mouths open, releasing a slot the instant an ETA crossed its dip, letting the queues cycle through him like calls rolling off a trunk line. Staggered holds. He'd run the same discipline on a Friday night with the bars emptying. Hard cutoffs next. The cruel arithmetic. He decided in advance, never in the moment, because deciding in the moment is how an operator locks up and loses the whole board. That a slot held past a certain tax got cut clean. He wrote the rule into himself like a number taped above a console. A breach that wouldn't turn by its 3rd climb came off the live row. He did not watch the candle. He logged the line and moved his hand and let the freed slot pull the next worst soonest up from 400. And he did not, would not, count the ones he cut. He counted the ones he kept. That was the only ledger he allowed himself. The grease taught him the rest. Tallow ran down the console's lip in slow yellow ropes, and he scratched the day's clusters into the cooling drips with a thumbnail. A crude graph in candle fat. Bad hours marked, quiet stretches marked. The shape of the parish's suffering laid out like a dispatcher's call volume chart. Dawn ran heavy with breech berths. Dusk brought the knife debts, men 3 cups in and owing. The squalls walked off the carved water on a schedule the sea apparently kept to the quarter hour, and once he'd seen the schedule, he could seat the fisher's slot before the squall even crowned the horizon. Prophecy he filed as forecast. The lines that climbed unbidden, the ones that named him, come quick, the keeper. He stripped of their dread and read his data. An omen was only an ETA, with the math hidden, and he had learned to do the math. He stopped flinching when a rank 300 line spiked. He looked at what fed it and seated accordingly. Below, Whisper learned the cold voice in the stone could be trusted. He couldn't hear that directly. He read it in the smoke. More thin wood smoke threading up under the tower's tallow, as houses that had been emptying began to keep their fires lit. A second column, a third, the parish exhaling again through its chimneys. Olin's prayers carried the change in their cadence. Less begging, more reporting. The man had become a floor manager. 2 more clerics joined the relay by the 5th day, and the lines started arriving clean, location first, severity tagged, a queue that did half his sorting before it reached his hand. He built it the way you build anything from nothing. 1 working part, then the part that feeds it, then the part that catches what the first 2 drop. For 6 days the candles held. He counted them at the top of each shift, the way he'd once counted operators down a dim room, 1 through the high hundreds, and the number did not fall. The queue stayed 400. It always would, immovable as a tide. But beneath that fixed black wall, the small flames stopped going out. A long shelf of them burning steady, a ledger of everyone still breathing in his parish. He held 7 where another man held 1. He taught the 7 to do the work of 70. The rift number bled in the rock, 60-some days and falling at its honest rate of 1 per day, and he let it fall. He had a system now. A system absorbs a deadline. On the 6th night, he forecast a quiet window. The wave chart showed a trough, a clean hour, the kind he'd have used to send a shift to the canteen. He stood Olin down to sleep. He pulled his hand back from the cold to rest it. Then the board lit a cluster that wasn't on the wave. Off schedule. Out of the pattern the sea kept. 11 lines climbing at once from the dim depths, fast, in no dialect he drilled, something feeding the cue that did not answer to the tide, and did not appear to be in any hurry to explain itself. 11 lights, and not one of them his. They climbed in a dialect built from stops, consonants like knuckles working a locked door, and they settled high on the board, over the dawn breech berths, over the dusk knife debts, over the whole steady shelf he'd spent 6 days lighting, because whatever fed them had ruled their need greater than his parishes. The math wasn't his to argue. The board sorted by severity, and let the far realm cut his cue the way a chief patches a screaming priority over a hold. Strangers. He read the seals as they crested. 2 carried the Margrave of Solt's mark, salt country, weeks of walking from any chimney he knew. The rest answered to no name he'd drilled, no tide he'd charted, climbing fast and off schedule, and the worst of them sat at rank 9 with an ETA already dipping toward the floor, where a slot would open or the line would burn. 7 slots. 3 live under tax. 4 open. He could give the strangers 4. He could let the breach at his own dawn edge slide to make room, could pull his hand from the fissure he'd been holding through the squall, could spend the whole parish he'd built by hand, answering knuckles in a tongue that had never once arrived location, severity, need. He did the arithmetic he'd taped above himself. His parish was signal. Strangers were noise. An operator who works every call that screams loudest finishes none of them. And he had not built a floor and a relay and a forecast in tallow to break it for 11 lines feeding from somewhere off his charts. He muted them. One at a time, the way you drop the volume on a console you can't serve, he took each below the cut. Their light didn't gutter clean like a snuffed candle. It thinned. It went to a flat gray hush in the stone, the exact texture of a line ringing into a house where the receiver lies on the floor, beside someone who has stopped reaching for it. And he had heard that hush, once. On a recall he hit 8 times. Papa? Clipped to tone, tone, tone. He heard it now in 11 new throats. He logged none of them. He counted the kept. That was the only ledger he allowed. Low in the dark, near the bottom of the 400, one small line had been burning wrong for days. Rank 380-something. Too far down to earn a slot, too stubborn to die. A flame the size of a match head in the cold floor of the queue. He'd flagged it the second day and meant to let it go. Instead, he'd started feeding it. When a slot burned out, when a breech wouldn't turn by its 3rd climb, and he cut it and moved his hand, there was a residue, a last warmth bleeding off the dead candle before the stone went cold. Nothing the seating law accounted for. He caught it on his palm and tipped it down into the dark, into the small, wrong flame, the way you'd cup a coal to a child's hands. It steadied. It learned to expect him. The cadence rose to meet him. Whisper Village, the accent he'd drilled into a clean cue, a girl's line among the first that had ever talked back to the cold voice in the stone instead of begging it. Shenya. She didn't climb. She never asked for a slot. She only burned brighter when he fed her, and dimmed when he didn't, and he found himself timing the scraps to the burnouts now, harvesting the dead to keep the one small light he had no protocol to keep alive. It cost nothing, he told himself. The dead candles were dead either way. She was parish, he told himself. Signal, not noise. Near the end of the shift, he looked at the 11 dark slots where the strangers had been, and waited for the tide to do what the tide always did. The queue refilled. It always refilled. 400, immovable, the black wall that didn't move no matter how many flames he saved beneath it. Snuff one, and the depths sent up another to take the rank, the parish thinning while the number held. 11 slots sat empty. He watched them. He swept the count, one through the high hundreds, muscle memory down a dim room of consoles, and came up short. 389. The wall had a gap now. 11 cold sockets where light should already have crowded back, and nothing rose from the deep to fill them. The tide hadn't moved. Something had heard him cut the line, and instead of screaming louder, it had gone quiet and stayed quiet, holding the dead air open, the way a caller does when they already know your name and have decided to wait for you to say theirs. Day 28 opened on a number that had skipped its own arithmetic. The rift fell at 1 a day for 6 days, then stalled the night the tide failed. A patient hold he logged and refused to name. It moved now, not by 1. He read the carved digits twice, the way he'd reread a callback that came in wrong, and twice they said the same. 9 days gone in a single dark, the counter shedding them like a fever breaking the wrong way. He began the shift the way he began every shift. Count the kept. He couldn't. The queue had lost its floor. 400 had been a ceiling, immovable, the black lid he worked beneath. Now lines crowded up past it, 460, 520, ranks stacking faster than his eye could climb, every flame in the stone leaning toward the cut like reeds under a wind with no source. The ETAs fell together. Not staggered, not a tide with a dip he could seat against, but one front, every line cresting the same drop in the same breath. The spread he'd built his whole relay to ride, folding flat as spilled water. 7 slots, the same 7, the only number that had never once moved for him. He seated the worst, took the pull at the base of his skull, watched the ETA reverse, and 4 lines behind it crested the identical dip before he'd wiped his palm. 7 was no longer a budget. It was a sentence he read aloud over a room full of people who could all hear him deciding. He held 3. He cut to make room. He cut the way you patch a screaming priority over a hold, except every line screamed now, and the cut stopped being triage and became subtraction. His charts died first. 6 days he'd graph the parish in cooling tallow. Rates, dips, the windows where Olin's runners could reach a chimney before the feared thing landed. The forecast had a shape. Tonight, the shape was gone. Every prediction he'd let harden into wax ran one direction now, toward Whisper, toward the cluster of ranks all bearing one seal, all dipping at 1 hour, all rising out of the same hole in his map. The hollow. Under Whisper. He read the location off 40 lines at once, and they gave him the same ground. The wooded basin below the village, the dead grove the salt country seals had been walking away from for weeks. The prayers carried images now, not words. The cold voice surrendered him pictures the way it had surrendered him the tongue. Roots that moved, bark splitting wet, the grove churning like a thing turned over in its sleep, bleeding pale tendrils up through the loam toward the chimneys, and the chimneys praying location, severity, need, in the clean cue speak he'd drilled into them, every line of it true, and every line of it converging. 40 parishioners, 1 mouth of cursed wood, 7 slots. He stopped counting the queue. The queue had become weather. He counted what he could still touch. Olin, 1 floor down, his relay's first manager, runners already on the basin road. He could pull them back or send them in, and not both. Whisper's bell, ringing the wrong rhythm, a village emptying uphill. The fissures and breaches and fevers in the rest of the parish, the ordinary catastrophe of a working night, every one of them sliding red while he spent his 7 on a hole in the ground. He kept his rule. Decide cutoffs in advance, never in the moment. He'd written that into himself with both hands, and the deep had read it, and the deep had built a night with no advance left in it. Every line arriving already past its tax, every cut already overdue, the whole instrument tuned to make him choose at the moment and watch the flame go out. The candle burned where he wouldn't look. Low in the wreck of the board, below the churn, one small light held its rank. 380-something, where he'd left it, the matchhead he'd fed off the dead.
It hadn't climbed. It never climbed. While 500 lines stacked above it and the hollow bled under the very village where she burned, Shenya's line sat exactly where it always sat. Steady, dim, waiting for the scrap off his palm, the one flame in the floor that wanted nothing from his 7. He reached for the next burnout. Habit. A breach had failed its third climb. He cut it, caught the residue, tipped it down into the dark toward her the way he had every shift since the second day. The small flame took it. Then it did what no line in 400 had ever done. It moved. Not up the ranks. Across the law, climbing nothing. The rank number beside it holding fast while the flame itself swelled and steadied and turned, deliberately, like a head lifting off a console, like a receiver picked up at last from the floor where it had lain through 8 unanswered tones. The cold voice came through Shenya's line. It used his daughter's word. Papa? He did not answer it. You don't answer a line that isn't a line. The word came up through Shenya's flame in his daughter's mouth, and he tagged it the way he tagged everything, unconfirmed. Source, unverified. Hold. Do not engage. Because the deep had learned his tongue, then his rule, and now it had found the single syllable that would make a dispatcher reach across his own protocol with both hands. He counted the kept instead. 3 held, 40 cresting. Olin 1 floor down working the callback board, 2 clerics on foot relaying outcomes, runners strung out along the basin road, lamps a line of orange beads sliding toward the grove, close enough now that he could pull them back or spend them, and not both. He kept his palms on the live slots. He let the flame say its word into the dark and did not turn his head toward the place where it burned. Then the stack moved without him. A line he hadn't seeded climbed through the churn. Not cut, not fed, just rising, its rank number, shedding digits like a man going downstairs in the dark, 410, 390, 360, hauled up out of the cluster under whisper by nothing his hand had done. It arrived carrying a voice before it gave him a location. He knew the voice the way you know a regular's breathing before they manage the address. Yerrick, the foster boy. The one Whisper had drilled badly and then well, who prayed the fields out of order every time and caught himself. Need, no, location. The small stammer of a child minding a discipline 3 sizes too big for him. Artyom had heard that correction across 40 nights of training the chimneys to speak clean. He'd logged it as a quirk in the relay. He logged it now as a face. The boy prayed the way he'd been taught. Location, severity, need. Clean Q-speak in a register that hadn't dropped yet. Every field filled. The order right. Tonight, of all nights, the stammer gone, and the picture behind the words came apart even as they held. A pale root risen waist-high out of the loam, wet bark splitting along a seam, the boy's foot swallowed to the ankle in something that breathed. The grove had lifted him up onto a tendril, the way you lift a splinter on a fingertip. Severity climbing untouched. Need. One word, the only word a child keeps for it. Standard intake. He moved to seat it. The ticket gave him its timestamp. Not a clock. He had no clock here. A shape. Every line that crossed the console wore the mark of when it opened, and he'd quit reading them tonight because they all opened at once, all one front. This one wore a shape his hands knew without asking permission. The tone count stacked at the head of the ticket like vertebrae. 8. 8 before the surrender. The exact interval he had once dialed into the dark of a board that stayed green, recall after recall, while a curve at the highway loop kept his daughter's last word and handed it back to no one. The same timestamp shape. Yerrick's ticket and Lena's call, struck from one die. He read it twice. The deep could counterfeit a voice. He'd already ruled that, muted that, walked away from that down on Shenya's flame. It could not counterfeit the Q's own bookkeeping. The timestamp was his system, his instrument, the one honest field in the room, and the honest field told him the child on the tendril had opened his line at the same interval, in the same shape, as the call he had failed to answer once and would carry as workload until whatever passed for the end of him. To seat the boy, he had to drop a live slot. Slot 3. The squall front off the carved water, A quarter hour of fishers he'd held since the tide failed and the count came up short. A whole reach of shoreline still breathing because his thumb sat on it. Olin's runners had cleared 2 of those chimneys an hour ago. The relay working as built, the floor managing itself for once. And the slot was the only thing keeping the rest off the bottom. Drop it, and they crested together. All of them. The number behind slot 3 was a number he did not let himself say, and he made himself say it now, in full, because the rule was decided in advance, and the advance was gone, and a foster boy was praying location severity need off a route that breathed. 300 odd against 1. He'd built the whole instrument to never have to read that sentence aloud. Staggered the holds. Seated ahead of the pattern. Cut clean and counted only the kept, so the math stayed math and never became a face with a stammer in it. The deep had read all of it. The deep had taken his rule, and his tongue, and his daughter's 8 tones, and assembled them into a single second, and set it down on his console like a meal. He put his thumb over slot 3. The fisher's flame leaned warm into his skin, hundreds deep, and beneath it, Yarek's line held its borrowed timestamp up out of the churn like a hand reaching from a stairwell. And Artyom understood, cold and entire, the way you understand a thing you have already done once. The deep had not built him a trap. It had built him the night again. Same curve, same 8 tones, the same impossible second in which a father chooses, and the board, whatever he does, stays green. He took his thumb off slot 3. The fishers stayed lit under the space where his signature should have gone. 300 odd, breathing. He left them breathing. The math waited on the console, finished and clean, the easiest ledger a dispatcher has ever handed. 1 against the many. Sign here. And he declined it the way you decline a confession written in another man's hand. Recalculate. 7 slots. He ran the load cold, the way he ran every shift. The breech berth line off the east chimneys, the knife debt at the ford, 3 squalls seated ahead of their quarter hour, slot 3's reach of shoreline, and behind all of it the relay holding the floor. Olin on the manager's bench, the clerics walking outcomes door to door, Whisper feeding clean location severity need up the stack across the 40 nights he'd spent teaching children to speak like a console. 7 filled. No 8th. There had never been an 8th. Only the dark place in the carved law where the count stopped. The line that drove the pain. The one that had seated him in this chair with a board gone green at his back. 7 for the parish. None for the boy. He looked at the law. The law was tallow and indifference and held. So he did the arithmetic the law had no column for. For 6 days he'd skimmed the residue heat off cut and burnt-out candles, tipping it palm down into a too low flame, rank near 380, timing each scrap to a burnout. A keeping that cost nothing, he'd ruled, because the dead were dead and the slots were full, and he had never once asked the empty place to hold a living line. Now he asked. There was no key for the 8th. He found it the way the prayer tongue had found him on the first night, by surrender, hand flat on the cold blank the keeper before him had left dark, refusing to lift it. He reached for Yarek. He seated the boy in the slot that was not allowed to exist. The white came up his arm like a wire pulled taut through the marrow. Not light. The shape light leaves when it's gone. The same nothing that had bloomed behind his eyes at the board while the recall stacked its tones into a dead curve at the loop. His hand locked to the console. His count started on reflex, the floor he never crossed. 1 through 7, and stop. 1. 2. The white took the 3rd number before he could set it down. He lost the count. First time. 28 nights and he had never lost the count. Had muted the 8th line 100 times rather than hear past 7, where the names stopped being names. And now the number wouldn't come, and the boy's flame caught in the slot anyway. Low. Alive. A child's pulse ticking up the stack while the pain rang the length of him like a struck rail. Yarek. He said it. Out loud, into a room with no air to carry it. Not the rank. The name. The mask he'd worn since the first prayer flooded in. Triage, cue, protocol, dead air. Slid off his face like wet bark off a seam, and underneath was only the thing he'd refused to log for 28 nights. A man at a console, holding a slot open with his own nervous system, because somewhere a foster boy had prayed the fields in the right order on the worst possible night, and a curve at a highway loop had taught him exactly what it cost to let one tone go unanswered. He held it. The fishers held. Slot 3 never dropped. The 8th burned where nothing was meant to burn, and the white climbed past his shoulder into the side of his skull where the first stroke had set its flag, and he understood, distantly, in the dispatcher's back-of-the-mind way that logs your own collapse as an incoming, that this was the line that killed the keeper. This was always the price of the 8th, not the deep's trap, the system's true cost, filed in the one field he'd refused to read. He kept his hand down. Shenya's fed flame guttered somewhere below the cut, the residue gone, all of it spent into holding. The tallow tallies on the console's lip began to soften and run in the heat coming off him. He counted what he could still count. 6 parish lines, 1 boy, 300 fishers. The numbers blurred and doubled, and he held them the way you hold a regular's breathing on an open line. Present, unanswered, refusing to hang up. The boy's ticket still wore its timestamp at the head. 8 tones, the vertebrae of a call he'd failed once. Then the 8th tone, the one that had always cut clean, the last before the surrender. The place where Lena's papa went to no one, did not cut. It held. A 9th tone struck the head of the ticket, a sound from the dead curve that had never, in any night he'd lived or died through, rung at all. Boots on stone that had no stairs. He logged them before he saw them, 2 fronts converging the way the 40 lines had converged on the hollow, except these came carrying steel and incense instead of need. The chamber that had held only him in the carved light, filled with men who used the word requisition the way he used hold. The Margrave of Soult came first. Gray at the jaw, a signet worn to a smear, mud drying on boots that had ridden hard to reach a tower no map placed. He did not look at the candles. He looked at Artyom the way a quartermaster checks a delivered weapon for transit damage. So the tower has a hand again. Behind him the Hierophant of Vale, saffron and frankincense. A thurible swinging its little censer smoke in slow figure eights. 2 acolytes holding the train clear of the running callow. The smoke crawled along the console's lip and curdled where the heat off Artyom's locked arm still cooked the wax to soup. His count was gone. He reached for it. 7, and stop. The floor came back ragged, the numbers doubling, the 8th slot ticking warm under his palm with a child's pulse he refused to take his hand off. Ruth masses a column at my eastern ford, the Margrave said, unrolling it like a duty sheet. You will seat my garrison at the head of your stack every dawn. Point this at Ruth, and I feed your parish through the winter. Grain, salt, 100 men. He set a fist on the carved law as if it were a map table. A weapon's only worth the arm that aims it. The Hierophant's voice came softer, which was worse. The tower is Vale's by the old covenant. The allotment of mercy is the church's to dispense. I have come to consecrate the keeper and take the keys. 2 demands, 1 cue. He filed them where they belonged. Incoming, both unverified, both wanting the same 7 slots set by who knelt nearest the throne and not by who was burning. That was the line he could not cross. Patronage at the head of the stack broke triage at the root. Severity was the only sort the law could read, and the moment a Margrave's ford outranked a drowning fisher because the Margrave had ridden up the stairs in person, the board went green over a city of the unanswered, the way a board had once stayed green at his back. He could not refuse them. Refusal was a closed line, and you never hang up. So he did the only thing the night had ever let him do. He intaked them. Your 100 men. He heard his own voice come out flat, dispatcher flat, the cadence he'd drilled into whisper across 40 nights. They don't guard your ford. They run outcomes, door to door, under a manager named Olin. Your grain doesn't buy slots. It feeds the clerics already walking the parish on foot. He turned the ruined count toward the Margrave like a ledger. You want your ford seated by severity? You bring me location, severity, need. In that order, clean, every dawn. The stack reads it, or it doesn't. I don't aim, I cue.
The Margrave's jaw worked. A man who'd come expecting ordnance and found an intake form. To the Hierophant. Your acolytes learn the 3 lines. They feed prayer up the stack the way the boy did off a breathing root. Consecrate nothing. Teach them to speak like a consul, and I'll seat whatever they bring me on its merits. No sooner, no later. He was conscripting principalities into a relay. Pressing 2 crowns down into runner work and clerk work, the way he'd pressed a frightened ringer into a bell and a foster boy into the 8th. Building the floor outward, because 1 pair of hands had already cost him his nervous system, and the night had shown him, with the rift shedding 9 days into 1, that he could not staff catastrophe alone. The mask he'd lost over Yerrick did not come back. Another came.
He felt it set. Not the keeper triaging the world, but the thing that traded a slot for a road, and a road for a granary, and called it survival. The thing the lords had climbed here to make of him. You barter mercy like a herring at the dock, the Hierophant said. I ration it, Artyom said. There's a difference, and you'll learn it, or you'll go back down the stairs that aren't there. Under the haggling, faint, the 9th tone still rang at the head of Yarrick's ticket. The sound from the dead curve that had never rung in any night he'd lived through, unlogged, holding while he sold off the future in slot-shaped pieces to men who thought they'd come to buy a weapon. He understood then what he was doing, the way you understand your own collapse as an incoming, not keeping, governing. He lifted his free hand off the console for the first time since the boy caught delegation, the floor manager's first sin, and pointed it not at Ruth's Ford, but at the Margrave's chest. You're my first runner, he said. Take the manager's bench. Olin will show you the cue. Slot 5, twice in one breath. The law gave 7, and you spent 7. 1 line to a slot until the caller closed or the caller died. But he held slot 5 a half-second past the squall's answer, and caught the barley barge riding the same warmth behind it. 2 prayers threaded through 1 eye of light, and the carved board logged both as served. He'd cheated the count. First time in 40 nights. Olin looked up from the manager's bench. The Margrave sat beside him, sleeves shoved to the elbow, a tally stick where his sword had hung, sounding out a runner's chalk before he'd admit he was learning to read it. Stagger 3 and 6, Artyom said. Open them late. Clear the fast line, ride the slow one in on the same heat. It worked twice more. 90 minutes across the parish, and 90 minutes as a refugee column past the ford. A breach turned, a roof fire walked back to embers. He had the Margrave's 100 drilling the timing now. Runners posted at each chapel, so the relay could feel a stagger land and a stagger fail. A machine of legs and chalk built outward from 1 chair because 1 chair had already cost him the use of his hands. The 3rd stagger missed. A heron-thin line out of the eastern fen. Old woman, flooded cellar, water at the chin. Cued behind a faster call that ran long, and the warmth closed, and her tone thinned to nothing in the time it takes to say, held. He logged her. He did not say the word. Then he reached for the thing he kept off the books. Shenya. The flame too low to seat. The line he'd been feeding scraps of warmth against every law the dead keeper carved into the blank. A candle stub of a prayer that should have guttered on day 9. He'd kept it lit. Now he learned what it was for. A thread runs both ways. He fed a seated prayer down Shenya's low line and out the far side, warmth reaching a hamlet no slot would ever rank, relayed through a flame the queue couldn't see, like patching a dead call through a payphone the system swore was decommissioned. 12 souls. Off the board, alive on borrowed heat. The borrowing came due somewhere. It always did. Warmth is finite, and what he spooled down Shenya's thread he stripped off the top of slot 2, and a fissure on slot 2's shoreline, one of the 300 he'd refused to trade away, went under while the relay sang. He caught it in Whisper's report, location, severity, need, the need unmet in the flat, drilled cadence he'd pressed into her across 40 nights. He made her say it twice. Callback discipline.
He wanted the timestamp clean, even on a line already cold. He had a relay that multiplied reach. He had slots that served 2 for 1. He had 100 swords turned to legs and a granary turned to bread on the move. Every trick bought hours. He paid for the hours in voices he could hear stop. Then the Deep sent a column down the Ruth Road, 200 on foot, and a thing walking the ditch beside them in the dark, and no 7 slots in any world could screen 200 at once. So he baited it. The Deep wanted a voice. It had wanted one voice since the night the rift shed 9 days, the one it had built in a low flame to make him lift his hand. Papa? 8 tones he'd refused, and never cut. He'd kept that line too. Off the books. A candle he would not hand to the wind. He dangled it now. He opened Shenya's thread wide, and let the counterfeit sing down it, loud, bright, a daughter's voice broadcast off the Ruth Road and out into the fen, and the thing in the ditch turned toward the sweeter line the way every hunter turns toward the wounded one in the herd. The column walked. 200 pairs of feet on the road, unhunted, 2 miles of it gone quiet behind a lure. The bait worked because it was real warmth, real heat off a real line. To make the voice carry 2 miles, he had to feed Shenya everything at once, empty the stub, spend it whole, run it until the wax was soup and the wick a thread of light. He counted the column across, 191 of the 200. He'd take it. A dispatcher takes 191. The flame went out at 191. Last thing down the thread before the dark closed over it, 8 tones, and then, because he'd opened it wide, because he'd made it scream to carry across a fen, a 9th, the one from the curve, the one no night had ever let him hear answered. His thumb found the cold blank where slot 8 held Yarek's living pulse. He did not reach past it. There was no 9. There had never been a 9, and he had just spent the only place that voice had ever lived to buy a road 2 miles of silence. The board went green. He logged the column. He did not log the flame. Frost on the carved law by morning. The tower had no weather, but the blank where slot 8 cupped Yarek's pulse ran cold enough to fog his breath, and he read the board through it the way he'd once read a ward chart through a cracked window, squinting, trusting the numbers over the glass. 2 fronts by the 3rd bell. East through a flash flood and the barn down on a milking shed. Tight cluster. Fast ETA. North through a slow red that wouldn't crest for hours. Drevya. 6 parishes hung off the cold edge of the board like coats off a hook he could just barely reach. Slow meant later. Later meant Whisper went east. She always went east. She was the sharpest instrument on the floor. 40 nights he'd drilled the cadence into her until location severity need came out flat as a metronome. No breath wasted, no scream leaking into the field to foul a timestamp. The acolytes could pray, Whisper could report. When a front ran fast and the slots came up hot one after another, you sent your cleanest line, and his cleanest line had a name, and her name was the reason East closed green 4 times running. He logged it as efficiency. Build the machine, feed the machine. The machine spends your best part hardest. Drevya, he kept reading aloud. That was the process. He spoke each waiting ticket in the prayer tongue, callback discipline, kept the cold lines warm in his mouth so the queue knew they were still owed. He'd done it for weeks. The miller's wife at Tovska, breach, turned twice and held both times by a cleric he'd dispatched on foot. The twins at the salt weir. An old man whose line opened every dusk with the same complaint, a cough that wasn't drowning yet. He knew their timestamps the way you know a regular caller's voice before they speak. He read them, ranked them, set them under the faster front, and told himself, next. Next is a word a dispatcher uses to keep his hands from shaking. The 5th front came east heavy again. Of course it did. He sent Whisper. It was the right call. He could run the math cold, and the math came up east every time. ETAs collapsing on the near cluster, 3 slots opening inside a minute. The relay built to feel a staggerland, needing its truest reader there to feel it.
He had 100 runners in chalk at every chapel, and bread moving on the road, an engine grown outward from one chair, and the engine said east. He sent her east. North went quiet under an acolyte half-trained, a boy who prayed the 3 lines in the wrong order under pressure and seated need as severity, and the Q, fed bad shape, ranked Drevya's slow red below a squall that bought itself an early seat. He noticed the silence the way you notice a fan that stopped. Not a sound, the absence of one. The north edge of the board, which had murmured for weeks. 6 parishes worth of cold lines he read aloud each round, gave him nothing to read. He reached for Tovska's timestamp out of habit, the shape his mouth knew, and his mouth closed on air. He called for callback. The acolyte couldn't raise it. Olin ran a cleric north on the fastest legs the Margrave's 100 had, and the relay waited the way a phone waits, and the report came back across the floor in a cadence nobody had drilled, because nobody drills men for this. Drevya was dark, not falling, fallen. The slow red had crested, while his cleanest reader closed barns 2 provinces south, and the front had walked the 6 parishes in the order he'd have walked them himself, severity first, and there was no one fast enough left on the board to feel it land. He read the queue for survivors. The field gave him none to rank. So he did the only thing the chair had left him. He read the names. The miller's wife at Tovska, breech, held twice. The twins at the salt weir. The old man and his cough that wasn't drowning, until it was. He read them in the prayer tongue, flat, the drilled cadence, location, severity, need, and the need column came up the same for all of them now, a single, unmet value, and he made himself say each one twice, the way he'd made Whisper say a cold line twice. Callback discipline, clean timestamp, even on a line that would never call again. He counted them. He counted past 7. He had built a rule on day 1 that past 7 the names stopped being names, and he had spent 40 nights building a machine precisely so he'd never have to count past 7. And now the machine handed him a number with faces on it, and he counted every one because there was no slot to mute them into. The blank under his thumb held Yarek's pulse, warm, living, one line he'd refused to let go dark. North of it the board showed clean, no red, no tones. 6 parishes worth of green where green meant nothing left to rank. He did not log the names, he had already said them. The console hummed under his palm, cold as morgue tile, and gave him the next front. He read the silence where Drevya had been. It read back nothing. He had hunted alone for 9 winters and called it discipline. 1 bow, 1 set of tracks read off frostbitten mud, no second pair of eyes to correct him, no second mouth to slow him down. He had built a whole life on the smallness of it, proud the way a man is proud of a knife nobody else is permitted to touch. The empty board ended that pride. 1 throat could not hold 6 parishes. He had the proof in green, the worst kind, a row of clean lights where Drevya should have murmured, and the proof did not care what it had cost to read. So he opened the door. They came because Olin told them to, and because the bread had been arriving, and a man whose bread arrives buys obedience cheap. A miller's nephew with ink-stained cuffs. 2 scribes from the chapter house who could already letter in 3 hands. A girl of maybe 11 who had carried tallow up the tower stairs all winter and never once spilled a candle. Frightened, most of them, he counted them the way he counted callers, 1 through 7, no further, and then he counted again because there were 19, and 19 was a number he had no rule for. He taught them the cadence before the meaning, the way you teach a child to hold a phone before you teach them what to say into it. 3 lines. Location, severity, need. He made them say it flat. He made them say it twice. He took the stammer out of the miller's nephew by handing him 1 cold timestamp and making him read it 40 times until the words stopped being words and became a shape his mouth could keep while his hands shook. Because the hands always shook. His had shaken for 40 nights, and the cadence was the thing that held under shaking. He gave them slivers, not the chair stayed his, but the reading of it, the warm keeping of cold lines, the callback discipline that meant a waiting ticket was a ticket still owed. Those he divided. The tallow girl took North's 6 parishes to read aloud each round, so his mouth would never again close on air over a name. A scribe took the salt weir cluster, another took the east stagger. He sat at the center and let 19 throats do what one throat had failed to do. He hated how well it worked. The room learned to hum. 19 voices reading prayer tongue out of phase, a low overlapping drone, like bees worked up before rain, each warming a different cold line. And from the chair he could hear a parish drop the instant its reader faltered. An ear for absence, earned the only way that ear can be earned. The arithmetic was simple, and it was the cruelest thing he had ever assembled. 7 was the number a mind could hold before names stopped being names. He had learned it on the night shift the hard way, and spent 40 nights here proving it again. So he chalked the split on the slate by the door, and divided the 7 across the room. 3 to the girl, 2 to the east scribe, 2 to himself. No throat would carry more than its share. No single mind would have to count past the place where faces start, and the price of that mercy was 19 people who would now lie awake counting instead of 1. He did not tell them about the 8th. The girl mispronounced Jerevia. Soft, where it should have caught at the back of the teeth. He reached over and put 2 fingers on the back of her hand where it rested on the cold console, and said it once, correctly, the way you hand someone a tool by the handle. She fixed it. He took his hand back before it could mean anything. By the second night, they read without him prompting. By the third, they had a roster, names chalked beside parishes, a relief order so no throat read more than 2 rounds before another took its seat, a switchboard grown out of frightened mouths, the hunter who had needed no one, now the one head that all the other heads turned toward. The first real front came east-heavy. Of course it did. He had his hand on the blank, Yarek's pulse warm under his thumb, the math already collapsing ETAs onto the near cluster, the room already humming its overlapping drone, and before the board could rank it, before his own ear caught the stagger, the tallow girl stopped mid-line. She turned her face north, to a parish nobody had given her. She said a timestamp that wasn't on any ticket yet, flat, in clean prayer tongue, location, severity, need, the need column already read in her small, steady voice. He looked at the board. The board was green. 30 seconds later, it wasn't. He pulled the slate toward him and started a new list above the roster, one he had not known he was keeping, and at the top of it he wrote her name, and under it he left a great deal of room. The 9th night North held when it should have fallen. 3 parishes that no single throat could have warmed at once stayed green clear through the worst of it, because the girl read while the east scribe relieved, while the miller's nephew kept callback on the salt weir, and the corridor that had killed 40 of Artyom's knights now sat tame under 12 mouths working it in shifts. He logged it without feeling anything he would have called feeling. Saved corridor. Time, severity, resolution. He wrote the numbers, and the numbers were good, and the goodness of them was a stone in his boot. This was the thing the chair had never told him. The reach scaled. He had divided 7 into 19, and the 19 had multiplied it back, and now the board could hold ground he had only ever triaged into loss. Whole clusters that used to go red and stay red while he muted them, kept now, warm, owed and answered. A miller's bread had bought him a net. The net caught everything. The net also frayed where the hands held it. He watched the e-scribe's lettering start to slope. Small thing. Round 1, the man's chalk stood upright, each parish name square. Round 9, the wise dragged their tails like something bled. By round 11, he was reading a timestamp 2 seconds behind the line and not hearing the gap. And Artyom heard it from the chair, the way you hear a heater click off in a room you thought was warm. He pulled him, sent in relief. The scribe sat against the cold stone wall with his hands open in his lap, palms up, the way men sit when they have just set down a weight and cannot yet believe the weight is gone, and he did not letter again that night. 1 down. Artyom did not write it on the roster. He wrote it on the other list, the one above, under the girl's name, in the great deal of room he had left. The nephew cracked at the wrist before he cracked anywhere else. 40 repetitions had built a shape his mouth could keep, and the shape held, flat and clean, prayer tongue out of a face gone the gray of old tallow, while underneath it the hand that gripped the chalk shook the way Artyom's had shaken for 40 nights, and that was the cruelty he had not measured, that the cadence held precisely so well that it carried a boy straight past the place where he should have stopped. The voice does not warn you. The voice is the last thing to go. He had proven that on himself, and now he was proving it on children, one timestamp at a time. He started pulling them earlier, 2 rounds, not 3. He cut the share. The share was not the problem. The problem was Tasia. She was the East Scribe's relief, and she was good, 14, a chapter house hand who lettered in 3 scripts, and could read 2 parishes while her eyes tracked a third, and that talent was a kind of recruitment all its own. The more she could hold, the more he handed her. The same arithmetic that had grown the net, now narrowing to a point on one girl's spine. The rule of 7 sat chalked by the door where he had written it. She kept reading past it. He kept letting her. 12th round. East cluster lit 3 at once. He had 2 relievers down against the wall with their palms up and a cue that did not care. He had the math collapsing onto the near parishes. He had 1 throat left that he knew could carry the reed clean, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, already nodding, already drawing breath, taking the 8th slot before he had to be the one to hand it across. He let her. That was the decision. He let her, and he told himself it was triage, and triage is the word you use when you have run out of mercy and still have a board. She read it clean. Location, severity, need. All 3 lit parishes, flat, in order, the need columns going green under her voice one after another like lamps lit down a corridor, and the room held, and the corridor held, and somewhere 3 parishes of people who would never know her name went on breathing, because a 14-year-old had counted past the place where counting is safe. Then she stopped. Not mid-line, between lines. She finished the last timestamp correctly, set the chalk down on the console with both hands, square, the way you set down something you have decided not to pick up again, and she went quiet. Eyes open, looking at the board and not at the board. The hum went on around her, 18 throats warming their lines, and inside it she sat in a silence shaped exactly like the one he kept in his own chest, the one he had carried up these stairs alone for 9 winters and called strength. He had handed it to her by the handle. He crossed the room. He did not touch her hand. He looked at what she was looking at, the green corridor she had saved, and he understood that he had finally built the thing that worked, and that the way it worked was by spreading the crack in his own skull out across 19 younger ones, until each carried a hairline of it home. He went back to the chair. He picked up the chalk. He wrote her name on the list above the roster, under the girls, and left a room beneath it too. Put me in the chair. The tallow girl. 11. One arm straight out, finger on the seat he kept for himself. She'd watched Tasia read 3 lit parishes and run the arithmetic before the scribes ever could. The one who holds the most gets handed the most. Worth on this board counted in mouths held open against the dark, and she wanted hers counted at the top. He looked at her hands, wax crusted under the nails, not shaking. No, he said. He gave her no reason. The reason was the list above the roster, 2 names on it, the room left beneath them that he had told himself was kindness and now understood was forecast. He had been leaving space for her since the night she read the front before the board lit. That was the thing he hated worst about teaching. You learn what a person is for, and then you cannot stop assigning them to it. He sat her at the kettle instead, beside Shenya. Shenya held no slot. She could not let her, could not carry prayer tongue past the second line without the words coming apart in her mouth. Went gray at the cold the board hauled up the stairwell. And so she was the one thing in the tower he could not spend, which made her, by the only arithmetic he had left, the most expensive person in the room. The board did not slow for any of it. 11th round. A western parish lit and did not speak prayer tongue. It screamed. The open channel, the thing a reader hits when the severity outruns the words for it. And the boy on the slot, Pole, the miller's nephew's cousin, 16 and 4 nights trained, froze with the chalk an inch off the slate. Mute it, Artyom said. It's a past 7 you stop hearing names. Log the 7, mute the 8th. He put his hand over the boy's hand over the switch and pressed down with him, the way you teach a child to bank a fire, and the scream went to the held cue, where it would wait, or stop, and either way it left the room. Pole learned it in 3 nights. That was the part. By the 4th he muted the 8th without his jaw setting, his face gone to the flat tallow gray the cadence leaves on everyone who carries it long enough. And Artyom watched a boy acquire in 4 nights the exact stillness it had cost him 9 winters to grow. He logged the recruit ready. He hated the word the way you hate a tool that fits your hand too well. He had built a school for going quiet. He had been its first and only graduate, and now there were 19, and they sloped the Ys and steadied the wrists and muted the 8th, and the net held 3 parishes where 1 throat had failed at 1. The reach multiplied. The thing he had divided to survive came back doubled, tripled, every fraction of his ruin handed out and carried home in a younger skull. The core. Hold the line. He could not decide which of those orders he had given and which had given themselves. Every slot that broke gave him a gap. Dead air. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. While the relief climbed in and the broken reader slid down the cold stone with the palms turning up. And in the gaps, Shenya came with the cup. Always the same cup. Cracked at the lip, the crack mended with pine resin gone amber and hard, so the rim caught the lamp like a fish hook left in a board after the fish is long gone. She did not ask what had happened to the reader against the wall. She put broth into them with both hands around the back of their neck. She put broth into him the same way, and did not look at the board while she did it, which was the only place in the tower a person could stand and not look at the board. She kept her own count. He'd found it by accident, scratch marks on the doorframe, low, where a short girl would reach. Not the spent, the saved. 1 mark per parish that breathed at dawn, and the marks ran past 200, and she had never once shown them to him. He counted up. She counted what stayed. On the nights a slot broke, he learned her hands before he learned anything else about her. The resin ridge on the cup. The way she warmed the broth past comfortable, so it would still be warm by the time it reached a mouth that had forgotten it had one. He told himself this was logistics, recovery of broken assets. He knew it was not. The knowing was the only ledger in the room he did not keep in cadence. Tonight she filled the cup 4 times. 4 slots. 4 readers down the wall, palms up, while the relief came and the corridor held, and somewhere people who would not learn any of these names went on breathing. He watched her carry the 4th cup to Pole, who had muted the 8th so cleanly his hands hadn't even closed. And he caught himself, counting her, measuring the line of her shoulder against the weight a slot would put there, running the arithmetic before he could stop it. The one who can soothe the broken could soothe more if she sat closer to the breaking. And his eyes went, without his leave, to the list above the roster, to the room he had left beneath 2 names. There was so much of it. He had left so much room. Olin's bread no longer bought obedience. 6 days from the rift, it bought a frontier. 3 principalities whose marshals now queued behind a slate run by an 11-year-old, who weighed tallow by thumb and parishes by ear. The roads belonged to teeth. Every path crawled. The South Causeway, the Drover's Cut, the ferry road where a herring gull had stood on a fence post that morning and was gone by the 2nd round, post and all. He stopped routing relief overland. He routed it through mouths. 12 throats in the East Tower, 9 in the mill loft, the tallow girl reading drops across a valley she had never walked, and the whole apparatus, the core, the school for going quiet, the thing he had built 1 fraction of his ruin at a time, held the line because it was the only line left to hold. He ran 4 fronts off 1 slate, triage by cadence. He gave the marshals a flat 3-line tongue and made them speak it or wait, and they learned, the way men with swords learn to stand in a bread queue, because the alternative was the teeth, and the teeth did not negotiate. The reach had stopped being his.
It belonged to the roster now. The core, the order said, and the core built itself out of children who slept in shifts and woke already counting. 31 mouths. He knew the number the way he knew his own pulse, and trusted it about as far.
A slop broke in the third round, and he went to the kettle himself, because the relief was 4 breaths out, and the chair could hold 4 breaths empty. Dead air. He slid down beside the broken reader, the East scribe with the sloping Y's, and Shenya was already there with the cup. Cracked lip. Amber ridge. The rim caught the lamp like a fishhook left in a board. She fed the scribe with both hands around the back of the neck, not looking at the board, and under her breath she did the thing she always did, the thing he had never once logged because it logged as nothing. She carried the parish tongue to steady the boy. Location, severity. And on the third line the words came apart in her mouth. They always came apart. She could not hold past the second. Everyone knew it. He had filed it under cannot letter, cannot carry, the reason she held no slot and never would. He listened to the apart. Not noise. He had spent 40 nights alone learning the difference between a channel that failed and a channel that spoke too large for the words, and the breakage in her mouth was not failure. It was the same breakage, parish to parish, the same 3 syllables collapsing in the same place, a wound that fell open on the exact stress every time. He made her say it again. She didn't understand the asking. She said the third line, and it shattered, and he caught the shape of the shards. A thing in the wood, warden of beasts, fur or bark or both, an iron in its side that no parish had put there. Bound. Old. The teeth on the roads were not an army. They were a body. They came when it wept, and went where it grieved, and the rift was not a wound in the world. The rift was the warden, grieving, and the grief had nowhere to drain but out. He had built a school for going quiet around a scream. He had taught 31 children to mute. Past 7 you stop hearing names. Log the 7, mute the 8th. The 8th channel, the open one, the one that screamed where the severity outran the words. He had Pole close it in 4 nights and called the boy ready. One voice, the whole time. He had been muting one voice. He sat with the resin cup an inch from his hand and ran the only arithmetic he trusted, and it did not balance. You could not slot a warden. You could not route relief to grief, or cue a wound that old behind a tallow girl's chalk. Every protocol he owned answered severity with throats and need with bread, and not one line of the tongue had a place to write back to the thing that was screaming. Shenya set the empty cup down. She looked at him, finally, not at the board, never at the board, at him, and said the second line again, slow, the part she could hold, and stopped before it broke. She had been carrying the message for 40 nights. He had filed her under cannot. He stood. The chair was warm. The relief had not climbed in. The slate waited with its 31 mouths and its frontier and its teeth 6 days out. He looked at the muted channel, the dead light Paul had learned to kill without his hands closing, and he understood that he had spent the whole winter teaching the tower to refuse the one call it had been built to answer. He reached past the roster, past the list of names with the room left under them. He put his thumb on the 8th switch, the screaming one, the open one, the one no slot was ever meant to hold, and instead of muting it, he opened it all the way and let the warden's grief come up the stairwell into the room full of children who had only ever been taught to make it stop. Clean his throat on the slate, and it tore first. Yerrick. 19 nights without a stumble, the boy who'd read the tongue back to him in cadence before he knew a single word of it, who held the open channel now because his hands didn't shake and his voice didn't climb the way the others climbed. It climbed now. The third line came up his throat and broke on the same stress Shenya broke on, except Shenya was built to break there and let it pass through her, and Yerrick was built to hold, and the warden's grief was hollowing him out like a reed for the holding. His pupils had gone wide and flat, a thread of spit at the corner. He kept reading.
Artyom watched the boy's wrist where it rested on the slate, the small bones standing up under the skin, and he did the arithmetic he had been refusing since he opened the 8th switch, and this time it was clean, honest, no remainder to hide in the margin. One throat held the open channel. Yerrick's.
Pull him, and the channel closed, and the warden's grief drained back into the only ground it had ever found. The roads, the teeth, the 6 parishes whose drops came up the stairwell in chalk. Leave him, and the boy went where Tasya went. Read clean. Went silent. He'd seen the shape of that silence twice now and could draw it from memory. He counted the fronts. 4. North Relief was routed through 11 mouths and would hold a day past the wave if the bread came. The East Scribe with the sloping Ys anchored 2 parishes and a ferry crossing and could not be moved without dropping both. The River Corps ran 9 throats under the nephew, whose wrist had stopped shaking the night Shenya started feeding him from the resin cup, and they covered the Principality. The whole grain belt south, 40 villages, the count he had stopped saying out loud. Hold Yark on the open channel and the south went dark. That was the math. A throat for a principality. He set it down on the slate in his own hand because the chalk did not lie, and his mouth might. Then he started naming the silences. Not muting them, naming them. He went down the roster the way he went down the queue on the old night console, 1 through 7 and no further. And beside each front he wrote which parish he would let go quiet and at what hour, because a silence you chose by name was a different weight than a silence that happened to you. And he had decided 40 nights ago that he would carry the first kind and refuse the second. Kresno. He wrote it. The ferry parish, downriver, 12 drops a night, and after the wave it would get none. And he wrote the hour next to it like a tide. Dolny. Wrote it. The 2 hamlets above the white quarry, whose name he'd never learned and now never would. He left a blank where the name went and put the hour anyway, and the blank sat there worse than any word. Shenya came along the bench with the cup. She did not look at the board. She looked at Yerrick, at the flat, wide eyes and the thread of spit, and she set her hand flat on the boy's chest, the way you'd test a door for fire, and she said the second line, the part she could hold, slow, into the side of his face, the part before the break, over and over, the safe 2/3 of a prayer, a railing for him to keep one hand on while the rest of him went out into the grief. Yerrick's reading steadied a half beat, not enough to count. Artyom looked at the resin cup, at the amber ridge along the rim catching the lamp, and made the last entry. He had been pricing every throat in the room for a slot all winter. He had priced Shenya twice and hated the number both times. He wrote her in now, not on a slot, under Yerrick, holding the railing, the one tether that let the boy carry what no slot was built to hold, the only allocation on the slate that cost nothing he could name and everything he couldn't. Every slot accounted, every silence chosen by name. The blank above the white quarry, chosen too. He stood. The chair stayed warm, and he left it warm. 31 mouths, 4 fronts, 1 principality marked to fall in his own chalk, and the open channel pouring the warden's grief up the stairwell into a room that had finally stopped trying to make it stop. The frost on the high glass had begun to sing, a thin glass note rising, the way ice sings before a thaw or a break. 6 days out, he'd told them. The slate said 6. The glass note climbed, and the floor took it up through his boots, and the chalk hour beside Kresno was wrong now. All the hours were wrong, because the singing in the glass was not the wave coming. It was the wave already at the door. Glass note. Gone. Snapped mid-climb like a wire cut. The tower took the silence and handed it back doubled. Every reader felt the floor drop the way a winch drops when the pawl slips, a half inch of nothing under the boots. And then the whole north face of the slate went white at once, 6 parishes firing, 4 fronts, chalk writing itself in their mouths faster than any hand could chase it down. Teeth on the Kresno road, East Scribe, flat. the sloping Ys already running. Wall of them, high as the ferry mast, walking, logged, hold. He did not look up. He ran the board the way he'd run the night console in the life before this one, before the tower, before the prayer tongue. Eyes on the cue, hands on the wood. Voice planed down to the three things a throat could carry. Where, how bad, what they need. The skull scream was a separate department. He filed it under noise. Dolney, North Gate, same wall, River Corps holding. The nephew, steady, his wrist quiet since the resin cup. 9 throats, grain belt clean. Quarry Road. The tallow girl, at the kettle, no slot, seeing the drops before the board lit the way she'd seen them all winter. 2 walls, closing. The hamlets above the white quarry, the blank where the name should go. He had written, let it close. The chalk did not argue. The teeth came over the ridgelines on every trail at once. Not a flood, a fence, white palings the height of barns, marching down the cuts in lockstep. And the prayer tongue went from 3 lines to 1 syllable repeated, the syllable for it is here, until the bench was a single instrument playing 1 note in 31 mouths. Artyom turned to Yerek. The open channel poured up the stairwell and filled the room past the rafters, and the boy's wrist on the slate had gone the gray of cold tallow, and Shinya's hand lay flat on his chest reading the safe 2/3 over and over, the railing, the half-beat that kept him. The 3rd line, Artyom said, to her, not to the board. Finish it. She looked up. One look at the slate, at the chalk hours, at the blank. The first time in 40 nights she had let her eyes touch the wood. Then she set the cup down on the bench, both hands free, and she said the broken line whole. Not the safe part. The part that came apart on the same stress in every parish, the part she had carried since the first night and never once spent. The warden's name for its own iron, the grief said back to the thing that owned it. She spoke it into the side of Yerek's face, and the channel carried it down the way it carried everything else, up the stairwell, out the trails, into the bound thing in the dark with the metal in its side. The teeth stopped. Every wall, every trail, a held breath the size of a province. Then the warden heard its grief come back to it in a human mouth, and it pulled. The teeth are its body. He had written that down too, under Shenya's 3rd line, 40 nights of it pointing here. The wall above Dolny leaned, hung, and poured itself sideways. Off the north gate he'd chosen to keep, down the throat he'd chosen to lose. The way water finds the one cracked tile and goes for it, and takes the floor. Kresno Road cleared. The ferry parish drained white. The flood ran where the silences had names, because a named silence was a corridor, and a corridor was a place to send a thing that had nowhere it was allowed to stop. River Corps, hold the belt. His voice did not move. North Relief, 11 mouths. Bend the wall east of the quarry into the dead hamlets. They take it. The girl read it before he finished. The nephew echoed clean. He worked the grief like a current through a sluice, opening one gate, closing another. Shenya feeding the line, and Yerek carrying it, and the 31 throats pointing it, and the worst hours of his second life went past in chalk and dead air, in hold and logged and let it close. In the one number he would not say, standing safe behind 9 river throats. 40 villages, the count he'd stopped speaking, while the marked corridors filled and went quiet at the hours he had written, one by one, on time, the way a tide comes in on the schedule you posted, whether or not you watched. Kresno at its hour, Dolny at its hour, the blank above the white quarry, last, at no hour he could name, because he had never learned to write it. Dawn came gray through the high glass. The teeth were gone off the kept trails, drained into the lost ones, the warden spent and grieving in its iron, and the channel finally, slowly, going dark. He turned to close it. Shenya was already at the doorframe, knife out, cutting a new scratch low in the wood, and then another, and another, faster than the lost ones, counting up past 200 into a number he would never be allowed to see. The queue emptied. 40 nights, and it had never once dropped below 100. Now the slate carried 9 throats and dead air on every front. The River Corps reporting clean, the belt clean, the ferry parish reporting nothing because there was no one left in it to lift a tongue. He counted the held first. Always the kept number before the spent one. because the kept number signs the next orders, and the spent one only sits there. Shenya's knife still finding new wood. 240 when she stopped to flex her hand. He logged it. Belt secure, principality intact, river core to stand down in pairs. Then the other column. He had refused it all night, the figure he would not put in his mouth behind 9 safe throats, and now the work had gone thin enough that it came for him anyway, parish by parish, in the hand he'd written himself. Kresno, Dolny. 2 hamlets above the white quarry, blank. The tower had cooled under his palm, the hum dropping out of his teeth for the first time in 6 weeks, and the high glass let a flat gray in over the bench, finding every name and every blank without preference, the way fog doesn't choose which fence post to settle on. Yerrick now. The boy was still on the open channel, pupils wide and flat, the gray of cold tallow run all the way up to his elbow, his mouth still working the one syllable, though the thing it pointed at lay spent in its iron, pulling at nothing. A reed keeps playing after the breath stops. That was the danger. A held channel does not close itself. Someone closes it, and whoever sits on it when it shuts goes where it goes. Shenya's hand lay on his chest. The railing. The safe 2/3, over and over, the half-beat that kept him this side of the door. 1 throat strength left in the room before the channel sealed. His. A choice the size of a thumbnail, and the weight of the column he wouldn't read. Spend it down the last trail. Confirm the corridor above the quarry stayed shut. Seal the strangers he'd already conceded. Buy the dead hamlets the small dignity of staying closed. Or spend it on the boy. Pull him back through the shutting door by the half-beat, and leave the last corridor to close itself or not. Blank, unwatched. A silence he'd never be allowed to name, because he'd chosen not to stand over it. He had built the whole bench on the first answer. Strangers over throats. The slate over the name. 40 nights running. He looked at the blank above the white quarry, then at the gray creeping past Yerrick's wrist into the flat of his hand. Pull him. Shenya's eyes came off the board and down onto the boy, and she folded the safe 2/3 into a hook and set it under his ribs and drew, while Artyom put his own palm flat on the slate, the cold tile of it, the console of that other life, and closed the channel from the top down, fast, the way you cut a line dragging a man under, taking the door shut on the empty corridor, on the blank, on whatever was or wasn't still moving above the quarry. The channel went dark. The syllable stopped in Yerrick's mouth. He sagged into the railing, breath catching like a stalled flywheel. Once, twice, then turning over, wet and ragged, and his. The wet at the corner of his lip. The wide eyes narrowing a hair, climbing to the rafters and stopping there. Alive. Scooped hollow where the holding had taken him. A reed that would whistle wrong in cold weather the rest of his life. And breathing. And his. He didn't write that number anywhere. He would carry it without a column. The blank above the white quarry stayed blank. He let his palm rest on it 1 beat, the chalk dust cool against the heel of his hand, then drew the line under it himself. Not let it close this time, but closed by me, his hand, his hour, the one silence he would sign in the first person. Shenya was already cutting again. 241, 242 for the throat in her lap. Dawn finished coming up gray. The slate sat clean of teeth. The queue sat empty. The dead column sat full, and he stood in the warm draft off the chair no relief was coming to take, both hands on the cold board, a dispatcher at the end of a shift that had broken every throat it touched and kept the belt. He turned the slate to clean wood for the next watch. Then he made the last allocation, the only one left, that he would sit the chair again at dark, open the channel again, split the 7 again, choose again, and carry every silence he chose, by name where he could reach it, and by blank where he couldn't. All of it, eyes open, in the first person from here on. 7 stools now, where the bench had been. He'd taken a saw to the long plank himself, 1 cut per reader, and the curls of pine still sat unswept in the corner because sweeping was nobody's slot, and he hadn't written one for it yet. The throat that had been his was a roster. Tasia held the first slot, location, her voice gone flat and true after the night it broke. The tallow girl had the 4th, and read severity with her jaw set like a clamp, dropping nothing, not even the hard stress in the middle that used to throw her. The East scribe sat third. He still came apart on the last line. Everyone did. That was the warden's grief and not the man's. But now when he tore, there was a fifth mouth a half beat behind to catch the location, and a sixth to carry the severity while the railing went up around him. A bucket line. Hand to hand, no single arm asked to carry the whole fire. He logged the change without ceremony. 6 weeks back, he had counted 1 through 7 and muted the 8th, because past 7, the names stopped being names. Now the 8th had a stool. The 9th had bread, courtesy of Olin, whose loaves still bought obedience, and now bought a relief shift besides. 2 readers asleep on grain sacks in the next room, while 7 worked and 1 tended the kettle. The kettle ran low and constant, broth smell laid over cold slate smell, and Shenya moved between the stools with the ladle the way he had once moved between consoles, reading not the board but the readers, whose hands had gone grey at the wrist, whose breath had caught, who needed the safe 2/3 spoken into the side of the face before the third line came for them. She had taught it. The railing. Not the broken third. That was hers alone, the 40-night message, the warden's own name for its own iron. But the safe front of the prayer, the part that held, the half-beat a tearing reader could keep one hand on. 4 of them could lay it down now. A girl could sit beside a breaking man and be the door he didn't go through. The hollow had quieted. Down the 8th channel, where the teeth had screamed for 40 nights, there was something nearer a long exhale. The warden lay in its iron, eased, not freed, and the readers had learned to speak to the grief instead of fighting the body, to name the wound instead of wrestling the mouth. The teeth came less. Where the corridors had crawled, a cart could cross Kresno's stones in daylight, and Olin's wagons ran the grain belt road with 1 outrider instead of a prayer. They were sending children now, from parishes he'd never read, a boy from somewhere above the white quarry with the cadence already in his mouth, taught by someone he'd trained. The prayer tongue spreading the way a grass fire crosses a fence line, mouth to mouth, past anywhere one throat could sit. He drew them a second board. He wrote the slots in chalk and left the 8th line for Shenya, unslotted, the tether under all of it. Then she finished her round. She set the ladle across the kettle's lip and folded down onto the floorboards by his stool, tally slate in her lap. 242, and a new column begun under it, the saved counted on past where he'd lost the ability. Her shoulder found the leg of his chair, her head tipped, by degrees, onto the warmth of it. Her mouth still moved. The second line, slow, the way she'd said it the night the East scribe broke. Location, severity, and then the held breath where the third should come, and she stopped before it broke. Stopped on purpose. Asleep, and stopping on purpose. He put one hand down, not on the board, on the crown of her head, the way you test a sleeping child for fever, and left it there a beat, counting her breaths instead of the cue. The channel hummed low, eased. The iron was still in the warden's side, and an eased thing is not a mended thing. Somewhere under the long exhale, far down on a line he had no slot for yet, beneath the new stress the boy from above the quarry carried without knowing what it meant, he heard it. Faint. Patient. Below the floor of the cleaned board, in a cadence none of them had taught, something began, very quietly, to count back. A number, surfacing through the floor of the board like a stone through ice. For 3 nights he'd called the counting the warden's, because the warden was the thing with grief enough to run a tally up the 8th channel. Wrong. The cadence under the cadence wasn't the irons. Smaller. 7 beats, a pause, 7 again, patient as a busy signal. And on the 3rd night, his chalk stopped against the slate because he knew that rhythm the way you know your own pulse in a dark room. 7 digits. An exchange he had dialed 1,000 times and answered, once, too late. He let the cue blink without him. Tussia carried the first line clean. The bucket caught the e-scribe's tear. The railing went up and down without his hand on it, because he had built it to run without his hand, and now it did. And that left him alone with the count he had refused to name for 6 weeks. The old board came up the way cold water comes up a boot. 400 in the queue, 7 slots. A headache shaped like the console.
A light it held on line 8. A girl, a road, weather coming down. And he'd had a girl on a road in weather coming down. And he had worked the 7 that screamed loudest, because triage is by volume, because a quiet line reads low severity, because low severity waits. It waited the whole shift. When he came back down the queue, the line was dead air. No location, no severity, no need. 3 flat lines gone to static, and a number that stayed lit on a board he had walked away from. 40 nights, then 40 parishes, then a whole frontier, and never once stopped seeing behind his eyes when he closed them. The manual had no entry for this. You cannot pull a throat for a closed line. There is no corridor to name her into, no hour to mark on a slate. No safe 2/3 a girl can speak into the side of a call that already ended. The warden he could ease. The teeth he could route through Cresno's stones in daylight. This he could only hold, the way he held the blanks. Location unknown. Severity total. Need to be counted at all. So he did the one thing left in the manual he'd written himself. He drew a new line. Below the working 7, below the 8th where the warden lay in its iron, below the 9th where Olin's bread bought a relief shift, a slot with no reader. He wrote the 7 digits in his own chalk. The dust caught in the seam of his cuff, like frost that wouldn't melt. He did not write closed by me. He wrote kept. Shenya woke against the chair leg. She did not ask. She read the slate the way she read everything now, front to broken back, and her mouth found the location, the severity, and then the held breath. And this time she did not stop before the 3rd line. She spoke it. Not the warden's name, the other one. The cadence counting back from below the floor, 7 beats and a pause, and she gave it the shape a name has when it is finally said out loud, after being held in static for 40 nights. And the countdown there slowed, the way a caller's breathing slows when the line finally clicks, and a voice on the other end says, "I'm here, I have you, go ahead." He put his hand on the console that was only stone, picked up, 40 nights late, logged anyway. He spoke the protocol he'd spoken 10,000 times to 10,000 strangers, and never once to her. Received, you're in the queue, hold, released, and the lit number did not go dark, because the dead don't come back up a channel. That isn't how the channel works. It stayed lit, it just stopped counting. A coal that finally sat still in the grate. The kettle ticked, broth smell over cold slate smell. Down the 8th channel the long exhale went longer, and the iron stayed in the warden's side, eased and unmended, and that was the shape of every true thing he'd learned out here. You do not undo the wave, you build the bucket line, you carry what cannot be set down, and you write the name so the next reader knows whose silence it is. The queue, when he looked back up, was quieter than he had ever kept it. Not empty. It would never be empty. Emptiness was a thing for men who'd never sat the chair. But the number at the top was one he could hold. 7 throats and a railing and children coming with the tongue already in their mouths, and the countdown that had been ticking towards some end had reset itself to a horizon he couldn't see the bottom of yet. He squared the chalk on its ledge for the morning shift. 1 slot kept, lit, still. The rest of the board, breathing. And the cold voice in the stone settled into the chair to choose again tomorrow, and the lamp held its small amber against all that dark, like a single answered line.